What's up, everybody? Hope everyone's doing good. This is a piece titled, it's a little long, how long is it? It's like 50 pages. So I'll see how long this takes. This might be a 2-video kind of deal. So this might be part 1, but we'll see. The piece is titled A Visionary Legacy to Russia, Europe, or A Visionary Legacy to Russia. This is by Maximilien Rubel. It has the headings Europe or Asia, ? The historical mission of the bourgeoisie, the mission of the proletariat, Asiatic despotism, a call to arms against Tsarism, ! A consideration of Russian messianism, the founder's bequest to Russia, charisma and political leadership, revolution, the social core, the political facade, reality and myth of the Russian Commune. Capitalist production relations and the communist ideology of domination, the commune versus the state, an age-long dream. And this text is from sorry, I'll get to the title again. This is by Maximilien Rubel. It's called from a book called Rubel on Karl Marx, 5 essays, edited by Joseph O'Malley and Keith Olgotson. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. There we are. Back to the wind. Historians of the past century saw Russia as a sphinx whose riddles... I fucking missed a quote. Jesus Christ, this is going to be a terrible recording. Anyway, first section. Europe or Asia, ? Quote, such is Russian propaganda, infinitely diversified, in keeping with the peoples and the countries. Yesterday, Russia was telling us, quote, I am Christianity. Tomorrow she'll say to us, quote, I am socialism, unquote. And that's from Jules Michelet, Légende démocratique du Nord, Paris, 1854. Historians of the past century saw Russia as a sphinx whose riddles were contained in the simple yet significant question, Europe or Asia. Even as late as the eve of World War I, the spiritual and cultural allegiance of this gigantic country still seemed uncertain. Her wartime participation on the side of the Entente and the revolution that broke out 2.5 years later finally revealed the long-concealed secret of Russia's historical decision, by irrevocably linking her to linking her fate to that of Western Europe, one of Peter the Great's own aspirations. The revolution, and especially the overthrow of Tsarism, had its prologue in 1905 and was long overdue. It therefore came as no surprise outside Russia, and certainly it was no surprise to Western Europe. What attentive observers had not expected, however, was that the leaders of a victorious political party that professed its adherence to, quote, scientific socialism would, in November 1917, proclaim the revolution to be a, quote, step towards socialism, unquote, mediated and assured by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Footnote. Dieter Groh has provided a very useful treatment of the points at issue, drawing from the pertinent literature in his book Russland und das Selbstverständnis Europas. Ein Beitrag zur europäischen Geistesgeschichte. End footnote. As recently as February of that same year, the members of the all Russian social classes and in particular the immediate participants themselves, had recognized the bourgeois democratic nature of this revolution. Now the politico-military general staff resolved that the rule of the elite would be regarded as a manifestation of the social will and, what is more, as a mandate for social reorganization. It is highly probable that neither the overwhelming majority of peasants nor the numerically weak industrial working class understood this decision as the expression of their own conscious aims. More important to the Russian peasants than any political ideology was their legal right to seize land. The workers inevitably saw the Bolshevist prospect of constituting a state power based on Soviets of worker, soldier, and peasants' deputies as the only way to bring the economic structure of their war-torn country under their own control. Thus, Lenin and Trotsky could have no illusions about the peasant and worker masses possessing enough intellectual maturity to comprehend and accept as the confirmation of their own will the Bolshevist postulate of a, quote, social revolution led by the working class, end quote. Lenin, in Theses on the Question of Immediate Conclusion of a Separate and Annexationist Peace, published in Pravda, 1918. It was therefore clear from the outset the future development of all facets of Russian society, material as well as intellectual, would be subject to the prescriptions of the party elite that had now become the supreme power. The peasant masses had been the mainstay of the Russian Revolution that began, as we read in the Communist Manifesto, with reference to the Western European proletariat as the, quote, independent movement of the overwhelming majority in the interest of the overwhelming majority, end quote. Communist Manifesto. However, it was transformed into a type of revolution not anticipated by the founders of materialist sociology. The revolution became the independent movement of a politically mature minority in the interests, no doubt honorably understood, of the immense majority. That Marx and Engels did not foresee such a development is no evidence of a defect in their theory, rather indicates the incompatibility of the dictatorial Bolshevist ideology with the notion of the proletarian dictatorship that Marx had conceived for the industrially developed countries that obeyed the laws of the capitalist economic system. Only through a thorough examination of the circumstances that led the Soviet Union, irrespective of Stalin, to proclaim itself the first, quote, socialist state, and to be recognized as such, can explain why its domestic and foreign policies can at the same time contradict the value judgments of Marx's proletarian socialist ethics, and yet be scientifically interpreted in terms of Marx's materialist theory of history. This theory demonstrates, on the one hand, the impossibility of a socialist way of life under the historical conditions of the 1917 Russian Revolution. On the other hand, it explains why a ruling elite found it necessary to use, quote, socialist ideology as an ersatz doctrine or religion. With the state power in its hands, this elite was bent on making its minority rule credible and thus acceptable under the guise of a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The subtle dialectic maneuver could be accomplished only by inverting the materialist theory of revolution, and then contrasting this inversion as, quote, genuine Marxism to, quote, vulgar and, quote, scholastic Marxism. Incredible as it may seem, the, quote, Marxist thesis used to justify the ideology of this elite can be reduced to the following theorem. Precisely because in October 1917, Russia fulfilled none of the economic, social, and intellectual conditions that in Marxian revolutionary theory are the prerequisites for a proletarian dictatorship and for a socialist upheaval, it succeeded in realizing the, quote, first stage of the world revolution, end quote. Quote, the first proletarian state, end quote. The, quote, step toward socialism, end quote. Footnote. Trotsky's theory of permanent evolution provides a characteristic example of his perfidious manipulation of dialectics, later empirically refuted. As late as 1928, in exile, Trotsky quoted with pride the following passage from an article of 1906, quote, in an economically backward country, the proletariat can come to power more easily than in the advanced capitalist countries. The notion of some automatic dependence of the proletarian dictatorship on the country's technical forces and capacities is a prejudice of a, quote, economic materialism, which has been simplified to the utmost. This view has nothing to do with Marxism, end quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. That's super interesting to me, because this is precisely like why Trotsky says that that the Soviet Union goes off of a socialist path. It's because it's like there's so much poverty in the country. There's so much dearth that you need the bureaucracy to police the dearth, and then the bureaucracy, make sure that its needs are met prior to the needs that it's policing. So it's very funny, like the kind of like, I think this is just true of things in general, just maybe in life. This is maybe just more of just like it's not like super philosophically grounded, and it's kind of like abstract, but I think this like people like to use determinism and free will generally to like suit their purposes, right? So if something is not good and works in your favor, it's it's forces beyond your control. But if it's something good, it's forces in your control. Anyway, quote, basically, this, quote, theory is limited to apodictic assertions or meaningless trivialities that simply decree the fait accompli of the party victory as the indubitable guarantee of conformity to any arbitrary formulation of social or historical laws. Actually, sorry, that's not a quote. Sorry, I thought there was a quote. This is a separate footnote. My bad. Anyway, end footnote. The theorem is the single logical conclusion that can be drawn from the Bolshevist theory of, quote, unequal historical development, quote, and its corollary of the, quote, weakest link in the chain of capitalism, end quote. Footnote. Basically, this, quote, theory is limited to apodictic assertions or meaningless trivialities that simply decree the fait accompli of the party victory as the indubitable guarantee of conformity to any arbitrary formulation of social or historical laws. See on this, quote, dialectics of regression, quote, Alfred G. Meyer's book, Leninism. In the introductory chapter of his book, History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky appeals to the so-called laws of combined development, according to which the, quote, revolution had in a few months brought the proletariat to power with the Communist Party at its head, exclamation point, and footnote. In Marxist terms, these propositions, quote, dialectically cancel the, quote, founders' critical materialist sociology of revolution. They represent an emotionally founded reversion to the beliefs of many 19th century Russian intellectuals, that there is an essential difference between Russian man and European man, and that Russia's vocation is to achieve the socialist or religious salvation of the world. The notion of Russia's historical mission, defined either in social, political, or religious terms, that is the, quote, Russian idea, end quote, is found not in Marx, but in Chedeyev, Herzen, and the Slavophiles, in Chernyshevsky, Tukhachov, and Bakunin, in Dostoevsky and Berdiaev, to name just a few important representatives of the multiple forms of Russian messianism. Footnote. According to Berdiaev, in 1917 proved that in keeping with Russia's special religious mission, the Russian Revolution could only be socialist, not in the sense of Marx and Engels, but in the spirit of the specific Russian tradition that was represented by Tukhachov, Lenin's predecessor, and exclamation point, in parentheses, rather than Plekhanov. Berdiaev's mystical view of history can reasonably be rejected, even if it is true that Russia's revolutionary vocation is a main component of Bolshevik ideology. Lenin, who saw in the backwardness of his country one of the historical causes for the fact that the revolution broke out earlier there than in other countries, and that, quote, that as regards its political system, Russia had overtaken the advanced countries in a few months, end quote. Lenin, in The Impending Catastrophe and How to Combat It, written in September 1917. End footnote. New section, the historical mission of the bourgeoisie. Whether interpreted as socio-ethical, pragmatic, political, or pseudo-religious, the notion of a historical mission, not only of the modern working class, but also of the bourgeoisie in the process of freeing itself from feudal modes of production and life, is the pillar of Marx's conception or model of history. Footnote, see especially the description of the revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie in the manifesto of the Communist Party. End footnote. To be sure, Marx sought to establish the, quote, materialist nature of that consciousness of great revolutionary tasks that he ascribed to both the exploiters and the exploited, deriving it from the pressure of the economic conditions of existence. But this did not prevent Marx or his student Engels from playing the role of moralizing mentor throughout his political career, and accordingly from exhorting how the bourgeoisie, now the proletariat, to fulfill its historical tasks. The first imperative was to channel toward new revolutionary outbreaks the liberal and national forces that had been restrained by the restoration policy of the Holy Alliance, which forces that had been accumulating in Western European bourgeoisie since the French Revolution. It was equally important to prepare as favorable as possible the terrain in which the fledgling workers' movement could act and develop, by making impossible, once and for all, any reversion to absolutism. A few months later, before the February Revolution, Marx circumscribed unambiguously and with uncommon precision the historical relations between the two main classes of modern society, justifying, quote, materialistically, unquote, his and Engels' abiding interest in liberalism and bourgeois democracy. I'm going to repeat that. His and Engels' abiding interest in liberalism and bourgeois democracy. Quote, why should they, bracket the German workers, in bracket, prefer the brutal oppression of the absolute regime with its semi-feudal consequences to direct bourgeois control? The workers know very well not only that the bourgeoisie must make them broader political concessions than does the absolute monarchy, but also that in serving business and industry, the bourgeoisie involuntarily creates the conditions for the unification of the working class, and the workers' unification is the primary prerequisite for their victory. They know that the withering away of bourgeois property relations is not achieved by preserving feudal relations. They know that the revolutionary movement of the bourgeoisie against the feudal estates and the absolute monarchy can only hasten their own revolutionary movement. They know that their own battle with the bourgeoisie can erupt only on the day when the bourgeoisie is victorious. They can and must assume the bourgeois revolution as a condition of the workers' revolution, but at no time can they consider it their goal. End quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx and Engels referred to this article 18 years later when attacking the, quote, socialism of the Royal Prussian government, end quote, represented by Johann Schweitzer in the Social Democrat. End footnote. The fervor of this statement reveals the profound meaning of Marx's lifelong vehement indictment of the political ideals of the Western bourgeoisie. These accusations showed Marx to be one of the most consistent revolutionary Democrats of his time. What is more, he considered himself duty-bound to act as the political educator of the bourgeoisie and, after the March Revolution, of the German bourgeoisie in particular. In this quasi-permanent attitude of a liberal attacking a bourgeoisie that clings to reactionary conservatism, we note the evident ethical tendency of his, quote, scientific socialism. If it may be rightly said of Edmund Burke that he, quote, incorporated the genuine political concerns of liberalism into the conservative worldview, end quote, then it can be affirmed with even greater justification that Marx incorporated these same genuine political concerns into his socialist theory of history. only in this context can we understand why Marx and Engels occasionally, and not only in the revolutionary year of 1848, used, quote, Jacobin slogans, quote. Their Jacobinism was not, parenthesis, as Karl Korsch held during his period of critical reevaluation of latter-day Marxist mythology, in parenthesis, proof that their revolutionary theory was historically qualified and limited. Rather, Jacobinism appears as a political necessity for a particular historical phase of development, to be borne actively by the bourgeoisie, as long as the social terrain of class struggle was obstructed by the overgrowth of feudal absolutism. In a word, it was a bourgeois moral weapon against a bourgeoisie that was betraying the bourgeoisie's historical task in favor of momentary interest, against the bourgeoisie that had the responsibility of the revolution, yet had formed a treacherous alliance with the counter-revolution. It's a footnote that I missed. It says, Siegfried Bonner's article, Zwischen, quote, Luxemburgismus und Stalinismus, quote, die, quote, Ultralinke Opposition in der KPD. That's an article in 1961. It says, Bonner deals with the view developed by Karl Korsch in various essays, that not only, quote, Trotskyism and, quote, Stalinism are founded on, quote, the, quote, neo-Narodnik and, quote, negation of the possibility of normal capitalist development in Russia, and, quote, but that even Lenin himself propounded, quote, with full consciousness and in contradiction to all his earlier explanations, the new Marxist myth of the essentially socialist character of the Soviet state in winter 1920 to 21, end quote. End footnote. How deeply the bourgeois Jacobinist element was rooted in the whole perspective of Marx's and Engels' theory of proletarian revolution is revealed in the following passage quoted from a series of articles in which Marx critically evaluated the German bourgeoisie in the light of revolutionary history after the dispersion of the Prussian National Assembly. Quote, unlike the French bourgeoisie... Sorry, is this a quote? Yeah, this is a quote. Quote, unlike the French bourgeoisie of 1789, the Prussian bourgeoisie was not the class that represented the whole of modern society against the representatives of the old society, the monarchy and the nobility. It had sunk to a kind of a state, as markedly opposed to the crown as to the people. From the beginning, it was apt to betray the people and to compromise with the crowned representative of the old society, for it itself belonged to the old society. It represented not the interests of a new society against the old, but the renewal of interest within an absolute society. An obsolete society. It found itself at the helm of the revolution not because the people stood behind it, but because they pushed it ahead of them. It was in the forefront because it represented not the initiative of a new society, but only the rancor of an old society. Slogans instead of ideas, intimidated by the world tumult, exploiting the world tumult, directionless energy, plagiarism in all directions, commonplace because not original in its commonness, haggling with its own wishes, without initiative, lacking confidence in itself and in the people, without a historical vocation, a cursed old man who saw himself damned to lead and mislead a robust people's first torrent of youth in his own decrepit interests. Sans eyes, sans ears, sans teeth, sans everything. Thus the Prussian bourgeoisie found itself at the helm of the Prussian state after the March Revolution, end quote. Marx, in a piece titled Die Bourgeoisie und die Counterrevolution, published in Neue Rheinische Zeitung, December 15, 1848. End quote. The collapse of the revolution proved not only that the bourgeoisie did not want to play the, quote, utmost revolutionary role proclaimed for it in the Communist Manifesto, but further, that it was far from wanting to create the world in its own image as the manifesto had announced in its dithyrambic notes. Not until Marx resumed his studies in revolutionary history and in political economy in London was he better able to understand the cause and course of the past events and estimate more accurately the prospects of the European workers' movement. He realized that because of the discovery of gold in California and Australia, and the very gradual formation of a European colonial empire, the historical role of the bourgeoisie in its capital was far from its conclusion. However, this insight did not prevent Marx from continuing to act as the nagging conscience of a bourgeoisie that was selling itself out to the reaction in 2 decades of the Bonapartist regime in France. The German bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie, both of whom sold out to the monarchy and to Junkerdom, offered him ample occasion to fulfill the same role. Where the hell am I? To the problem of the barely developing bourgeois democracy was added the crisis produced by nationalist aspirations. A crisis that could be resolved ultimately only by destroying the system established by the great powers in 1815. The irony of history, so often celebrated by Marx and Engels, willed that the adherents to revolutionary communism, who founded modern labor politics, were necessarily advocates of bourgeois revolutionary liberalism. By positing the overthrow of bourgeois democracy by the proletariat as the first goal of the incipient workers' movement, they committed themselves to support the realization of this democracy. Democracy was the price the capital-accumulating bourgeoisie had to pay the exploited producers, moral compensation, as it were, for their material oppression. And this is very interesting, and this is like such a huge overlap, in my view, between this is something that you could find in people like Draper, or at least there's this very a common thing. If you listen to the book that I have on here, what is it? I think it's an article I have on here by Alan Johnson, and he's talking about, in that article, it's about how Draper, and I think he's quoting actually Julius Jacobson, or maybe Phyllis Jacobson, who were kind of came from the same tradition and were friends of Hal Draper, and then they did different things politically after the breakup of the Independent Socialist League in 1958. I believe this year was the year it ended, as I recall it. We said something like the bourgeoisie prefers, or at least can prefer, and often does prefer, structurally does prefer, I would say, will betray the interest of civil liberties and the ideals of liberalism and the ideals of individual rights, if they come into conflict with the imperative conflict with profit making and the political influence of the bourgeoisie over society as a whole. And thus it is the onus of the socialist movement and the workers' movement to uphold liberal values, against the bourgeoisie, which is a super fascinating way of putting it, right? So that's a very interesting thing, and I think that kind of this is just a side note, but I think that the idea of the backwards revolution, or the revolution that is the socialist revolution that ostensibly happens in the background, that happens in these really backward countries, undercuts or kind of erases what Marx and Engels did view as the progressive qualities of bourgeois society and bourgeois democracy and liberalism. They it's like, oh well, since socialism can emerge just as much out of a recently destroyed aristocratic feudal society, then there's really, and since since socialism can just kind of be built immediately out of that in some capacity, then there actually is nothing distinctively progressive about bourgeois society at all, bourgeois liberalism. And you hear things like crazy shit like this all the time, basically sometimes when people act like there was actually nothing was achieved, for instance, that was substantially progressive in the Northern victory in the Civil War. You'll hear things, left-wing people literally say shit like that, where more often liberal people with kind of radical racialist ideas, there's kind of this and this is one of the things that I think is so important. I think the concept of beyond is so important, right? For a non-reactionary critique of liberalism, right? Is that emphasizing the way that the material base of bourgeois society does actually radically contradict its self-understanding as represented by liberalism and political economy, right? And that both if you think of Marx's example, a common phrase of the full and free development of each individual is the precondition for the full and free development of all, is something that, if you didn't know who was saying it, could come from a liberal, right? But Marx, the concept, I don't know, I'm probably using the word wrong because I'm not really great on these topics, but the concept of immanent critique, right? The idea of critiquing, I think of it as kind of a bourgeois society's utter failure to actually correspond to its self-understanding, right? The ideology of equal exchange before free private property owners actually has as its fundamental substance class exploitation and subordination to the law of value. So there's just this whole idea of I think this is very much kind of what is being said here by Rubel, is the irony of history so often celebrated by Marx and Engels willed that the adherents to revolutionary communism who founded modern labor politics were necessarily advocates of bourgeois revolutionary liberalism. By positing the overthrow of bourgeois democracy by the proletariat as the first goal of the incipient workers' movement, they committed themselves to support the realization of this democracy. Democracy was the price the capital-accumulating bourgeoisie had to pay the exploited producers, moral compensation, as it were, for their material oppression. New section. The mission of the proletariat. In order to fulfill the mandate of the French Revolution, bourgeois liberalism in the 19th century was obliged to center its European struggle on the formation of democratic constitutional nation-states. In view of this, it is understandable why Marx and Engels directed their political and educational activity within the workers' movement, chiefly towards spurring on, quote, the organization of the proletariat into a class, and thus into a political party, unquote. Here, both the goal and the limits of their activity were sharply circumscribed by the central axiom of their theory of revolution, according to which the, quote, historical spontaneous action, quote, of the proletariat needs no alien so-called socialist or communist system, no social plans concocted by systematizers to develop into a world-liberating power. The materialist conception of history that Marx and Engels elaborated in the mid-1840s was understood simply as a theoretical expression of the existing social movement, not as a, quote, primer for action, end quote, let alone a, quote, credo. Their attempts to influence the embryonic European workers' movement, first through the Communist correspondence committees and then through the Communist League, were designed mainly to add, quote, elements of education to the working class. When through the failure of the revolution of 1848 to 49, the workers were deprived of, quote, legal means of party organization and, quote, press, freedom of speech, and the right of assembly, and secrecy was the only course left open to the League, Marx felt he had to make clear to the representatives of bourgeois reactionary legality that the League's goal was, quote, the formation not of the future ruling party, but of the future opposition party, end quote, and that its task was not to, quote, prepare a revolution whose principal agents would be the bourgeoisie and the middle classes. Members of the League could and must leave this preparation, quote, to the general economic situation and the classes directly participating in it, end quote, because otherwise they, quote, would have to relinquish their own party position and the historical tasks which proceed from the general conditions of existence of the proletariat itself, end quote. There's two footnotes I missed. Quote, our theory is not a dogma, but the exposition of an evolutionary process, a process involving successive phases. To expect that the Americans will begin with the full consciousness of the theory elaborated in the older industrial countries is to expect the impossible, end quote. Engels, to Florence Kelly Vishnevetsky, December 28, 1886. Quote, our conception of history, is above all a guide for learning, no lever for constructions a la Hegelian, end quote. Engels to Conrad Schmidt, I think it says C. Schmidt, but I think it's Conrad Schmidt, August 5th, 1890. Footnote, even the March 1850 address of the League's Central Committee to the members, which was composed in a decidedly, quote, Jacobin spirit, authorizes no, quote, Leninist party fetishism. The postulate of the, quote, permanent revolution, quote, presented there stresses the progressive nature of the proletarian seizure of power as contrasted to a sudden upheaval. Hence the thesis that the foundation of a new society presupposes the previous rule of, quote, petty bourgeois democracy, end quote. Quote, the association of the proletarians not in one country alone, but in all the ruling countries of the world, end quote, as well as the concentration of the, quote, decisive productive forces in the hands of the proletarians, end quote. Marx. Or, I'm guessing that's Marx. During the 1850s and at the beginning of the 1860s, the, quote, Marx Party, a derogatory term that, if not invented by secret agents of the Prussian police, was popularized by them, and that gained a certain public notoriety in Germany during the Cologne communist trial, had no substantial contact with the abating European workers' movement. High-quality journalism, an intensive study of economic theory and practice, and work on his, quote, economics were Marx's main concerns during a period of personal financial difficulties, which Engels did his best to alleviate. This interim lasted almost 15 years, and of necessity not the proletariat but the world bourgeoisie stands in the foreground of all the writings that stem from it. Expanding in a feverish drive for power, this bourgeoisie knew, despite financial and trade crises, how to enforce the economic law of capital upon the masses of workers who had apparently fallen into lethargy. Even after capitalism had withstood the international economic crisis of 1857, which Marx and Engels had foreseen as the beginning of its end, Marx continued to express his revolutionary optimism, yet in a way that suggests that henceforth, given the growing worldwide domination of the bourgeoisie and capitalism, he reckoned in longer periods of time when gauging the chances of socialism in Western Europe. Quote, "The real task of bourgeois society is to establish the world market, at least its contours, and the production based upon it. Since the world is round, it appears that this has been achieved with the colonization of California and Australia, and with the opening up of China and Japan. The difficult question for us is this. On the continent, the revolution is imminent, and it will immediately assume a socialist character. Will it not necessarily be crushed in this small corner, since the new movement of bourgeois society is still ascendant in a much larger area?" End quote. Marx. Herr Vogt, 1860. When Marx wrote these lines, he was convinced that in spite of Austria's defeat in the Italian War, the days of the Bonapartist Empire were numbered, and that a new European crisis would result in violent social and national upheavals whose revolutionary hearths would be Germany and France. Footnote. See, for example, Marx's article, A Prussian View of the War, published in New York Daily Tribune, June 10, 1859. The, quote, Marx Party had strongly condemned Lassalle's animosity towards Austria, which amounted to a justification of the politics of Napoleon III, while Karl Vogt's slander campaign gave Marx a welcome opportunity to settle polemically historical accounts of, quote, imperial socialism and its ally, the Russian Tsar, quote, liberator of peoples, end quote. Sorry, that one quote that I said, the big quote earlier, was, I missaid that. That was from a letter to Marx to Engels. This last quote was from Herr Vogt. Reflecting on his post-1846 political career, Marx felt that he had to return to the problem of the historically conditioned relation between the communist working class movement and the bourgeois liberal movement. His concern was to break a lance for the moral purity of the party, understood, quote, in the eminently historical sense, end quote, end quote, of the term, and to make clear that his own revolutionary role was neither that of the founder of a system nor that of a party dictator, as his opponents insisted. He characterized his scientific task as that of, quote, critical insight into the conditions, course, and general results of the actual social movement, end quote. There remained the accusation in the Communist Manifesto he had elaborated, a, quote, proletarian catechism, end quote, expressing disdain for the bourgeoisie and esteem for the aristocracy. Marx's replies of decisive importance for the understanding he and Engels had of their own activity as propagandists at a time when political parties were first forming as part of the 19th century Western European workers' movement. Moreover, it may also be seen as an anticipatory criticism of those 20th century socialist and communist party movements that have developed in the name of Marxism and in the spirit of Lassalleanism. In Herr Vogt of 1860, Marx presents, with reference to earlier writings, his, quote, way of conceiving the relationship between the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, end quote. Quote, the first section of the manifesto, entitled Bourgeois and Proletarians, developed in detail the position that the economic and, therefore, in one form or another, the political rule of the bourgeoisie is the basic condition both for the existence of the modern proletariat and for the creation of the material conditions of the proletariat's liberation. The, quote, development of the modern proletariat is conditioned through and through by the development of the industrial bourgeoisie. Only under the rule of the bourgeoisie, does the proletariat rise to an extended national level, which enables its revolution to become national and itself create the modern means of production, which become so many means for its revolutionary liberation. Only the rule of the bourgeoisie materially uproots feudal society and levels the terrain on which alone a proletarian revolution is possible. End quote. Therefore, in that same review, I declare that any proletarian movement in which England does not participate is a, quote, tempest in a teapot, end quote. Engels developed the same notion in 1845. Thus, in countries where the aristocracy, in the continental sense, is still to be ousted, there is lacking, in my view, the first condition of a proletarian revolution, namely an industrial proletariat on a national scale, end quote. Marx. Concerning the relationship of the German workers to the bourgeois movement, Marx likewise appealed to the Communist Manifesto, raising the fundamental validity of the theses presented there to the highest norm of a rationally founded theory of labor politics. Quote, as soon as the bourgeois revolutionary appears in Germany, the Communist Party will battle in common with the bourgeoisie against the absolute monarchy, feudal landed property, and the petty bourgeoisie. However, it will not neglect for an instant to develop in the working man as clear a conscience as possible of the inimical opposition between bourgeoisie and proletariat. End quote. During the 1860s, which may be seen as probably the most decisive. Sorry, did I say end quote last thing? Sorry, I have to repeat this quote. Sorry, I spaced out for a second. Concerning the relationship of the German workers to the bourgeois movement, Marx likewise appealed to the Communist Manifesto, raising the fundamental validity of the theses presented there to the highest norm of a rationally founded theory of labor politics. Quote, as soon as the bourgeois revolutionary appears in Germany, the Communist Party will battle in common with the bourgeoisie against the absolute monarchy, feudal landed property, and the petty bourgeoisie. However, it will not neglect for an instant to develop in the working man as clear a conscience as possible of the inimical opposition between bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx. During the 1860s, which may be seen as probably the most decisive period both for the development of Marx's political theory and the elaboration of his, quote, economics, Marx found himself for the first time in the position of defending his highest ethical norm, the principle of proletariat self-liberation, before a wider European forum. Two events, Lassalle's agitation, so important for the revitalization of the German labor movement, and the founding of the International Working Men's Association, which represented a first attempt to surpass the limits of national efforts toward independence as the condition for the united action of the working classes in the economically developed countries, provided Marx with the long-desired opportunity of imparting those, quote, elements of education, quote, that he had acquired through painstaking, incessant study to men whose actions he expected would radically revolutionize social conditions. In his battle against the charismatic anti-liberal party politics of Lassalle and his heirs on the one hand, and against the romantic, histrionic, conspiratorial activity of Bakunin, and the Western European and Russian versions of that activity on the other, Marx fought two tendencies within the labor movement that were diametrically opposed to the creative principle of proletarian self-emancipation. These tendencies would finally flower only in the 20th century under the guise of Marxism in its multiple variants. Footnote: Marx detested the dictatorial, imperious style of the realpolitiker who shook Bismarck's hand, quote, in the interest of the proletariat, end quote. And that's in reference to Lassalle. It says, Hans Mommsen gives a concise general description of Lassalle in his article, Lassalle, in the book Marxism, Communism, and Western Society, edited by C.D. Kerning, 1973. The latest, most detailed political biography of the founder of the Allgemeines Deutscher Arbeiterverein by Shlomo Naaman, titled Lassalle. On Bakunin's aristocratic anarchism, see Ein Komplott gegen die Internationale Arbeiter-Association in the Marx-Engels works. End footnote. It must not be forgotten that both Lassalle and Bakunin consider themselves to be Marx's disciples with respect to their rationally founded understanding of history, however led by their own idiosyncrasies and charisma. They misused the master's social theory, using plagiarism and propagandistic subterfuge as expedients to legitimate their unprincipled action. Lassalle was unacquainted with the term Marxism, but which was probably invented by Bakunin in order to avenge himself on Marx by unintentionally confusing the master and his disciples, as he did with all Marx's contemporary followers. Bakunin, who believed the Russian peasantry would save the world, could have had no inkling that, scarcely 4 decades after his death, a party would come to power in his native land that would unite the contrasting tendencies of an elitist Lassallean association and a disciplined anarchist sect of true believers. When the Bolshevist version of 20th century Marxism made political capital chiefly out of the intellectual heritage left by Lassalle and Bakunin, the cunning of history triumphed once again. New section, Asiatic despotism. Throughout their political careers, first as radical Democrats, then as revolutionary communists, Marx and Engels fought Russian absolutism with a passion that could justly be called Russophobia. That their theoretical justification for this anti-Russian attitude amounted to a condemnation is not that their theoretical justification for this anti-Russian attitude amounted to a condemnation is not surprising when we consider that their conception of history was ruled from the beginning by ethical impulses. Their development from bourgeois liberalism to the anarchical communism seemed quite natural, and passing from apologetics for the democratic representative state in the period of the Rheinische Zeitung 1842 to an identification with the cause of the working class, Marx was led not by his critical study of political economy, but by his break with Hegel's philosophy of the state in 1843, and his awakened interest in the history of the bourgeois revolution in its English, North American, and French manifestations. Footnote: on the anti-Russianism of the German radicals produced by the left Hegelian school, see Helmut Krause's book Marx und Engels und das zeitgenössische Russland. Much less instructive is the short work by W.N. Kotov, Karl Marx und Friedrich Engels über das russische Volk, published in East Berlin, 1953. And footnote. The results of these historical studies are evidently clear in his unfinished critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right. We here find both the beginnings of his, quote, materialist interpretation of the relationship between the state and economics, and an effort to define a concept of democracy that far exceeds the limits of right as understood in bourgeois law. At this time, Marx recognized that Hegel's concept of the state as the, quote, reality of the moral idea, end quote, was, upon closer scrutiny, a, quote, religion of private property, end quote. Footnote, see Joseph O'Malley's introduction to Karl Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. On footnote. Undoubtedly, profound reflections of Alexis de Tocqueville and Thomas Hamilton on the inherently revolutionary consequences of North American democracy inspired in Marx the conviction that communism would prove to be a, quote, historical necessity, end quote, under liberal bourgeois economic and legal conditions. To Hegel's mystical, metaphysical conception of the state, which ultimately demonstrated that the monarch is the subjectivization of the state and the self-embodiment of popular sovereignty, Marx opposed the ethical humanist concept of creative multiform democracy. This concept permitted him shortly thereafter to take the logically consistent step toward communism as the ideal of a stateless and classless social order. The following quotation helps us grasp why Marx at times waged his battle against French, German, and especially Russian absolutism with a hatred that betrays the fundamentally idealist impulse behind his, quote, materialist understanding of history. Quote, democracy is the resolved enigma of all constitutions. Democracy is the resolved enigma of all constitutions. Here the Constitution, not only in itself, with respect to its essence, but with respect to existence, to actuality, always goes back to its real basis, the actual man, the actual people, and is established as their own work. The Constitution appears as what it is, the free product of men, ... Just as religion does not create man, but man religion, so the Constitution does not create the people, but the people the Constitution. In a certain sense, democracy is to all other forms of the state what Christianity is to all other religions. Christianity is religion par excellence, the essence of religion, deified man as a particular religion. So also democracy is the essence of every state constitution. Socialized man as a particular state constitution. ... All other forms of state are related to democracy as its Old Testament. Man does not exist for the sake of the law, but the law for the sake of man. Democracy is human existence, whereas the other forms, man has only legal existence. This is the specific character of democracy, end quote. Rubel. A few months later, Marx undertook a critique of political emancipation that brought him logically very close to anarchism. Quote, the existence of the state and the existence of slavery are inseparable, end quote. He concluded, we may assume with near certitude that when writing this sentence, Marx was thinking not only of Prussia, but also of its, quote, protector. We may assume that with near certitude that when writing this sentence, Marx was thinking not only of Prussia, but also of Prussia's, quote, protector, Russia, because Vorwärts, from its first appearance to its demise, was constantly concerned with Russian internal affairs insofar as they had become known through the sensational revelations of the Marquis de Custine. Footnote: beginning with the fourth number of the Paris Vorwärts of January 13th, 1844, many articles appeared dealing with Custine's book, together with refutations of it, prompted and paid for by the Russian Tsar. In many of Marx's later anti-Russian writings, there are thoughts and stylistic usages that recall de Custine's formulations. The French aristocrat had traveled to Russia in search of arguments against representative forms of government and in support of his monarchist convictions. He returned committed to the constitutional state. Passages from de Custine's reports of his travels may well have been deeply inscribed in Marx's memory. De Custine first lets an old Russian prince speak. Quote, "The barbarians invaded Russia scarcely 400 years ago, while the West was subjected to this crisis 1400 years ago. 1,000 years of civilization makes an immeasurable difference in the culture of nations." End quote. A. de Custine, in the book Rusland in 1839. Bracketed page numbers in this and subsequent references refer to the book Journey of Our Time, the Russian journals of the Marquis de Custine. Edited and translated by Phyllis Penn Cooler. Published in 1951 in Chicago. End footnote. The complete despotism. So this is the same piece, I guess. This is just different quote passages from it. The complete despotism which prevailed among us was established when serfdom was being abolished in the rest of Europe. Since the invasion of the Mongols, the Slavs, who until then were one of the freest people in the world, have become slaves, first of the victors, then of their own princes. Serfdom arose among them at that time, not just de facto, but as the constitutive law of the society. In Russia, it has devalued a man's word to the point where it is seen only as a snare. Our government lives on lies, for like the slave, the tyrant too fears the truth. Not only does Russian despotism count feelings and ideas for nothing, it alters the facts, battles the evident, and wins the battle. Because among us, the evident has as few advocates as does honor when opposing power. End quote. And that's from an old Russian prince cited by Custine. De Custine's first letters, dated from St. Petersburg, contain diplomatic testimony and remarks by historians familiar to Marx, including the Russian author Tsarism. De Custine quotes the description of Tsar Vasily III Ivanovich, taken from the correspondence mentioned by Karamsin, Karamsin, of von Herberstein, the German ambassador to the court, and then adds, quote, "This letter, written more than 300 years ago, describes the Russians of that time as I see them now. Like the envoy of Maximilien, I ask myself whether the character of this nation created the autocracy or whether the autocracy created the Russian character, and I am as much at a loss to answer the question as was the German diplomat." End quote. And that's from von Herberstein. With a feeling of horror, de Custine reports on the unanimity between the people and the government. What amazes him is not the fact that the Tsar does not discourage this idolization, but that in a giant country like Russia, no voice is raised to protest against the idolatry of absolute sovereignty. Quote, among the voices which recount these accomplishments to the glory of this one man, not one separates itself from the chorus to protest for the sake of truth against the amazing deeds of autocracy. One can describe the Russians, great and small, as drunk with slavery. End quote. De Castine. Nor did the condition of the Russian peasantry escape the Marquis. Quote, only with great effort can we form an accurate idea of the true situation of this class of men, who have no acknowledged rights but nonetheless are the nation. Deprived of everything by law, they are not so much morally degraded as socially debased. They have intelligence, occasionally pride, but cunning is the dominant element in their character and in their whole mode of life. No one has the right to reproach them for this, only too natural consequence of their situation. These people are always on guard against their masters, whose shameless treachery they must feel at every moment, and with great craftiness they get even for the master's dishonesty toward their serfs. Marquis de Castine. The contrast between Western civilization and Russian barbarism, which was current among the important bourgeois historians of the 19th century, and which Marx and Engels unhesitatingly appropriated, is expressed in a, quote, Marxist fashion by de Castine. Quote, it is all too easy here in Petersburg to be fooled by the appearance of civilization. When you see the court and the people connected with it, you believe you are in a country much advanced in culture and political economy. However, when you consider the realizations that exist between the various classes of society, when you realize how few in number these classes are, and finally when you observe in detail the customs and conditions, then you perceive beneath the revolting magnificence what is scarcely conceals genuine barbarism. End quote. Marx. The cowardly obsequiousness of the Russian nobility and of all higher levels of Russian society prompted the aristocratic observer to a general reflection that reminds us of Marx. Quote, an oppressed people always deserves its suffering. Tyranny is the work of nations. Within 50 years, either the civilized world will fall once again under the yoke of barbarism, or Russia will undergo a revolution more terrible than that whose effects are still felt in Western Europe. End quote. De Castine. Today, even Marxist thinkers are beginning to realize that the Russian Revolution has led to, less than 100 years after it had been so strikingly predicted. Today, even Marxist thinkers are beginning to realize what that Russian Revolution has led to, less than 100 years after it had been so strikingly predicted. But what Marx was able to read in De Castine definitely did not lead Marx to imagine that the Russian abuses denounced by the Marquis could be institutionalized in, quote, socialist dress and in the name of his teaching. Quote, the more I see of Russia, the more I agree with the emperor's policy of forbidding the Russians to travel and of preventing aliens from entering his country. The political system of Russia could not withstand 20 years of free communication with Western Europe. Marquis de Castine. Before his trip to Russia, de Castine had studied despotism by observing Austria and Prussia. By virtue of his Russian experience, he became convinced that these states were despotic in name only. Only now did it become clear to him what it meant to conjoin an absolute system of rule and a nation of slaves. In Russia, he saw clearly what results when the European mind and its science are united with Asiatic genius. This mixture appeared to him all the more frightening because potentially eternal. In Russia, unlike other countries, ambition and fear produced not general outcry, but universal apathetic silence. In the course of these reflections, the reactionary Marquis was struck by a comparison whose significance will escape no reader schooled in Marxism. Quote, "With what right, after all, do we censor the Russian emperor for his lust for power? Wasn't the revolution in Paris just as tyrannical as the despotism in Petersburg? However, we ought to introduce a certain qualification in order to establish the difference between the social situations of the two countries. In France, revolutionary tyranny is a temporary evil. In Russia, the tyranny of despotism is a permanent revolution." Marquis de Custine. This concept of, quote, permanent revolution has found its way in an altered form into the materialist conception of history inspired by Marx. To a still greater extent, this is also the case with respect to de Custine's notion of, quote, Oriental despotism, quote, based upon what he had personally witnessed. Quote, "Imagine the skill of our governments, tested over centuries of practice, placed at the service of a state still young and crude. Imagine how, in this totally new experience, the rubrics of the Western administrations would lend support to Oriental despotism, how European discipline would support Asiatic tyranny, how culture would be used to conceal barbarism for the sake of perpetuating rather than suppressing it. Imagine how the disciplined brutality and cruelty, the tactics of European armies, would reinforce the politics of the Orient. Imagine a half-savage people, regimented but uncivilized, and you'll understand the spiritual and social condition of the Russian people." End quote. De Custine. After his 5-month trip through Russia, de Custine looked back on what he had experienced, and in a final report, de Custine summarized his overall view in a series of aphorisms. Here, as it were, he passed judgment on that system of government on which he had modeled his personal aristocratic expectations. Let us examine his last letter, some of the verdicts, those verdicts, whose traces are discernible in Marx's and Engels' anti-Russian writings. Quote, "In Russia, the government dominates everything but quickens nothing. Russia, civilized late, was the only country robbed by the impatience of its rulers of a deep fermentation and of the blessing of a slow and natural development. Russia lacked that interior leavening which forms great peoples and prepares a nation to rule over, that is, to form others. Peter I and Catherine II gave the world a great and useful lesson for which Russia has paid. They showed us that despotism is never to be feared more than when it wants to be good, for then it believes that its goals justify its most outrageous actions, and evil which poses as a remedy knows no bounds." End quote. De Custine. Oh, this is still a quote. De Custine. Quote, "I do not believe I exaggerate when I assure you that the Russian Empire is that one country on earth where men are unhappiest, for they suffer simultaneously from the disadvantages of barbarism and the disadvantages of civilization. Measureless, monstrous ambition, an ambition which can take root only in the souls of the oppressed, which can feed only on the unhappiness of a whole nation, ferments in the hearts of the Russian people. This essentially acquisitive nation, greedy as a consequence of deprivation, has to pay in advance at home with degrading submissiveness for the hope of exerting tyranny over others. The fame and wealth she anticipates let her forget the disgrace she bears, and to cleanse herself of that blasphemous sacrifice of social and personal freedom, the kneeling slave dreams of world domination. End quote. De Custine. This is very interesting because I took a class right on when I was in college on Japan, and I can't remember what the actual group was called or what it was, but basically, like, after the Meiji Restoration, right, like, the bureaucracy had sent out like an entourage, right, like a group of people, like dignitaries, I guess, or something of that sort, to kind of they're trying to do this state building, engage in this state building process, right, and they're going from country to country, talking, examining like the social life of each country, right, and they go to the United States and they check it out, and they go to England and they check it out, and they go to Prussia, they go to Russia, right, and they have pretty mixed reviews of like all of the things that they see in these other countries, right, and what seems ultimately to be the most popular is Prussia for them, for a couple of reasons. Prussia being kind of like a latecomer industrially. I think it's part of the influence. Also, like the fact that it's like military autonomy was very important for it, right? It's Japan, and increasing the power of Japan and becoming like autonomous from the various imperialist powers that were attempting to, and were not attempting, but actually ongoing colonizing and exploiting Eastern Asia. That was important for them, the military aspect of it, and like the latecomer aspect of it, and kind of like the state manufactured like modernization, right? The state that was like a state, very much a matter of state policy in Prussia, to my understanding at least. Anyway, but if I were reading this though, and the delegation or whatever goes to Russia, and they cannot have worse things to say about it, basically. Like, they're like, basically like, this society is so ostentatiously exploitative, and like, they wouldn't use that word, but like the contrast between rich and poor, and how horrifying the nobility's like the wealth controlled by the monarchy and the nobility in the country versus the lives of peasants, or even like, I guess, like probably in this period, like the incipient working class that was in the cities. They thought it was funny, like they were like, this society is about to have a revolution. And this was like not like in like 1900. It was like seriously like 1870s or something like that, or 1880s, something like that, when they're like doing this, right? When they're kind of like figuring out how they're gonna like, what they're gonna model this new Meiji state oriented around like the emperor cult and whatever, which is but they just like were like, yeah, like fucking like they were just like, yeah, this is just like and these were like not like radicals, right? These weren't like, Marxist or something like that. They were like doing a world tour, like, what's the most exploitative place in the world or something like that. But these like these Japanese dignitaries are like, yeah, this society doesn't have anything going for it at all, and is not going to last very long. But that's what this is making me think of, because it's kind of a similar thing, right? Of like going to like a kind of like a journalistic-y kind of like estimation of Russian society as a whole, that comes out in stark and very much negative. Obviously, the thing that I'm talking about happens a bit later, and this is Marx is writing in the I guess it's like the mid 19th century. But that's just like a super super fascinating, like that their I don't know, that their estimations seem, at least in my mind, quite similar. New section: a call to arms against Tsarism! ! The idea that the bourgeoisie and capitalism are agents of civilization is a main pillar of the materialist conception of history. Marx and Engels worked out this theory together in Brussels in 1845-46, but were unable to persuade any German editor to publish the manuscripts entitled The German Ideology. Instead, they had to leave it to the, quote, gnawing criticism of the mice, end quote. Not altogether unwillingly, because its polemics by far outweighed the genuine theoretical part, that is, the introductory excursus containing a clear presentation of what was mainly Marx's theory of history. They were satisfied to have settled accounts of their, quote, former philosophical consciences, end quote, through this effort in, quote, self-clarification. The most important part of this methodological key to their analysis of society and history, which Marx later termed the, quote, guideline of his studies, is summarized in just a few pages of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels relate most of their theses to the revolutionary roles of the modern bourgeoisie and proletariat. What is striking about these assertions, which were presented as a description of existing social relations and social conflicts, is their note of expectancy. The manifesto seems to assume that the bourgeoisie has virtually fulfilled its historical function. The various levels of development of the bourgeoisie and the corresponding levels of political progress are described step by step with respect to the formation of the world market, which results from the development of industry and the means of transportation. It is conceded as a historically accomplished fact that the bourgeoisie has gained exclusive political control over the modern representative state and will draw, quote, all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization, end quote, by improving the means of production and commerce. In the light of the world events since the publication of the Communist Manifesto, and especially in view of the new historical era that began with the world wars of the 20th century, one cannot help but think of Friedrich Nietzsche's distinction between three different kinds of historical investigation: monumental, antiquarian, and critical. Footnote, quote, history understood in the Hegelian way, end quote, is dealt with on page 620. It's dealt with in book Vom Nutzen und Nachteil der Historie für das Leben, Werke 1. I guess that's Nietzsche's collected works. I don't know. Quote, history understood in the Hegelian way, end quote, is dealt with. It should be stressed, however, that Nietzsche's contemptuous treatment of, quote, history from the standpoint of the masses, end quote, is diametrically opposed to Marx's conception. End footnote. Marx viewed his own historical thinking as, quote, critical and as, quote, in the service of life, end quote. And thus he would have subscribed to Nietzsche's remarks about, quote, history as understood in the Hegelian fashion, end quote, about the, quote, priest of the mythology of ideas, end quote. The sketch in the manifesto that presents the developmental schema of the historically necessary domination of the world by the bourgeoisie should therefore be understood not as an acquiescence to the, quote, power of history, end quote, but as a wishful image born of the passion for freedom and the belief in a historic mission, quote, just as it, bracket, the bourgeoisie, in bracket, has made the country dependent upon the city, it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent upon civilized countries, peasant peoples upon bourgeois peoples, the Orient upon the Occident, end quote. Communist Manifesto. Although it may appear that Marx is stating a given fact here, he's actually anticipating a historical process of development whose beginnings coincide with the more or less rapid expansion of large-scale industry in Western Europe, and especially England. Upon closer inspection, the hymn of praise to the bourgeoisie proves to be a task with binding goals, both for those who are at accomplishment and for the gravediggers they produce, namely the proletariat that is abandoned to capitalist exploitation. The double-edged character of capitalist production corresponds to a dramatic conflict. Upon the stage of history, a drama is taking place that will be decisive for the destiny of mankind. The two antagonistic classes of modern society must play their roles in the service of a worldwide cultural revolution. This historical model, outlined in the manifesto, served as the theoretical basis for Marx and Engels' politico-journalistic activity in Cologne during the revolutionary year of 1848. At that time, they were expecting a proletarian revolution in France and a bourgeois democratic revolution in Germany. Their book, Demands of the Communist Party in Germany, contains no mention of communism, but there is talk of abolishing all feudal oppression, of introducing universal suffrage, of transferring the ownership of feudal estates to the state, and of creating a state bank, quote, to regulate the credit in the interest of all, quote, to regulate credit in the interest of all the people, unquote, and to undermine the, quote, rule of the big money men, unquote. The latter measure was intended, quote, to relate the interest of the conservative bourgeoisie to the revolution, unquote. Marx. Nationalization of the means of transportation, separation of church and state, limitation of the right of inheritance, establishment of national workshops, universal free education. Although this program envisioned goals more radical than those whose legal foundations were established by the French Revolution, its chief concern was nevertheless identical with that of the French bourgeoisie: the destruction of feudal property and, quote, establishment of the free landed peasant class, end quote. Marx. The manner in which 26 years later Engels discussed the domestic and foreign policies of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung is of great importance for the theme we are treating here. In 1884, he was able to write that the program of principles and tactics laid down in the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and adopted immediately thereafter by the, quote, party in Germany was still, quote, completely valid, end quote. Engels. With respect to the domestic policy of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Engels wrote, quote, the German bourgeoisie, which had only just begun to establish large-scale industry, had neither the strength nor the courage nor the pressing need to fight absolute rule in the state. The proletariat, undeveloped in this to the same degree, having grown up in complete mental servitude, disorganized and even incapable of independent organization, felt only vaguely its natural opposition to the bourgeoisie. Thus, although it was by nature a threat to the bourgeoisie, the proletariat remained its political dependent, frightened not by what the German proletariat was, but by what it threatened to become, and by what the French proletariat had already become. The bourgeoisie saw its salvation in every and any sort of compromise with the monarchy and the nobility, even the most cowardly. The huge mass of the proletariat, still unfamiliar with its own historical role, had at first to assume the role played by the progressive extreme left wing of the bourgeoisie. Above all, the German workers had to fight for those rights which were indispensable to their independent organization as a class party: freedom of the press, freedom to organize and to assemble, rights which the bourgeoisie had had to fight for in the interest of its own supremacy, but which in its anxiety it now wanted to deny the workers. The few hundred isolated members of the League were swallowed up by the huge mass which they suddenly catapulted into the movement. Thus, at the outset, the German proletariat entered the political stage as a most radically democratic party. End quote. Engels. Engels further summed up the political program of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in two main points: quote, a united, indivisible, democratic German republic, and war with Russia, together with the reestablishment of Poland, end quote. Engels. Recalling the Zeitungs foreign policy, he wrote, quote, "Support for every revolutionary people, a call to arms for the war of revolutionary Europe against the great mainstay of European reaction, Russia." From February 24th on, it was clear to us that the revolution had only one real fearsome enemy, Russia, and that this enemy would be increasingly compelled to enter the fight the more the movement took on European dimensions. The events of Vienna, Milan, Berlin postponed the Russian attack, but its inevitability was all the more certain the closer the revolution came to Russia. But if we could bring Germany to war against Russia, then Habsburg and Hohenzollern would be done for, and the revolution would be victorious all along the line. End quote. Engels. 12 years later, Marx commented on the anti-Russian attitude of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in a letter to Lassalle. Quote, "Concerning our relation to Russia, I think you are mistaken. Engels and I developed our viewpoint quite independently, and I may say laboriously through many years of study of Russian diplomacy. At any rate, Russia is hated in Germany, and even in the first issue of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, we presented the war against Germany as Germany's revolutionary mission. But hate and understanding are two entirely different things." Okay. Marx. Lassalle had written to Marx that, quote, "war against Russia," end quote, would be the, quote, "most popular, universally compelling battle cry that has ever been raised in Germany," end quote, and that he saw this war as Germany's, quote, "best and necessary heritage," end quote. Lassalle. End footnote. The crisis that broke out in the Orient in 1853 and the Crimean War that followed gave Marx and Engels the opportunity to defend in print, mainly in the American and English press, their theory of civilization and progress that they had conceived thoroughly in the spirit of the French Revolution. What they defended in their numerous articles were, quote, "bourgeois values, civilization, European revolution, and democracy." Commitment to these values determined their point of view and their judgment about the destiny of Turkey, the future of the Southern Slavs, and the unavoidable military confrontation between Western European powers and Russia. In defending these values, they did not hesitate to remind the politically ineffective French and English bourgeoisie, that is, the, quote, "class enemy," end quote, of the bourgeoisie's historical task and duty. Its mission was, awesome, as it were, to become the spokesman for a philosophy of history that stressed the heroic military virtues of progressive European peoples in face of the, quote, semi-Asiatic Russia and its aspiration for, quote, world domination. Hence, Marx and Engels rebuked the, quote, "foolishness, indolence, perpetual inconstancy, and cowardliness of the West European governments," end quote, in the face of Russia's policies of expansion and annexation. Hence, Marx's, quote, "cartel relationship" with the Russophobe David Urquhart. Marx admitted that the Scottish diplomat was quote, "subjective reactionary," parenthesis, romantic, end parenthesis, end quote, but assessed his tendency in foreign politics as, quote, "objectively revolutionary," end quote. In the fight against Russian absolutism, Marx and Engels felt that above all they had to advocate the, quote, "great movement of 1789," end quote. They did so through their political careers and never deviated from this approach, even when it became clear that the disintegration of Russian society had already begun and that therefore internal revolutionary forces were in play. The historical priority of the West in the social and cultural transformation of mankind was the primary ethical axiom of their materialistically founded social theory. New section, a consideration of Russian messianism. In Marx and Engels' materialist interpretation of history, the notion of a historic mission is ambiguously interwoven with the notion of a socioeconomically conditioned revolutionary mandate that classes as well as peoples are called to fulfill when their historic hour strikes. The geographical and historical realm in which the modern development and upheaval takes place is Western Europe and its natural offshoot, Europeanized North America. The instrument of power that the bourgeoisie employs to shape the world in its own image are the formation and accumulation of capital, both goal and purpose of the capitalist mode of production. The bourgeoisie, as it were, enjoys that famous, quote, royal right of culture to oppress and enslave the barbarians, end quote, extolled by Jacob Burckhardt. This point of view was defended consistently in 1848 to 49 in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, the, quote, organ of democracy, established by the, quote, Marx Party. In the struggle against the pan-Slavic tendencies that had surfaced since the Slavic Congress at Prague, the role of agitator now fell to Friedrich Engels. To a certain extent, the views Engels propagated were conceived of as the political manifesto of an ideal European revolutionary party whose scientific doctrine of civilization would oblige and entitle it to make sovereign decisions about the historical future of those peoples and races under the yoke of the Austrian monarchy. Engels took it to be self-evident that, quote, from all the nations and principalities included in Austria, quote, only 3 were still viable as, quote, bearers of progress, unquote, and therefore potentially revolutionary. The Germans, the Poles, and the Hungarians, quote, the mission of all other tribes and peoples, large and small, is simply to perish in the worldwide revolutionary tempest. Therefore, they are now counter-revolutionary, end quote. Engels. Footnote, see also Engels' contrasting view, letter to Marx, May 23, 1851, that the Poles are, quote, une nation foutue, to whom the Germans owe only re-establishment, quote, with suitable boundaries, provided there be an agrarian revolution, quote. Engels. Engels was certain that, quote, this revolution will be fully achieved in Russia, more likely than in Poland because of the Russian national character and the more developed bourgeois elements there, end quote. Engels. End footnote. To Engels, the principal sign of national viability was a wealthy industrial bourgeoisie. Only such a bourgeoisie would have the historical initiative. Engels has here provisionally excluded the proletariat altogether. Vis-a-vis the backward nations, the pan-Slavism wished to bring under the power of the, quote, Russian knout, quote, which I think is like a whip. K-N-O-U-T, I think it's like a whip. Even Bakunin's democratic pan-Slavism, which never went beyond the realm of purely moral categories, found no favor in Engels' Hegelian eyes, although he looked approvingly, for example, upon the civilizing conquest of the, quote, American people, who had saved, quote, magnificent California from the lazy Mexicans who did not know what to do with it, end quote. Engels. Footnote, see Engels' article, Democratic Pan-Slavism, in the book The Russian Menace to Europe, published by Paul Blackstock and Bert F. Hoselitz, 1952. Earlier, Engels based himself on Hegel in seeing the Slavic peoples as, quote, debris, subjected to the merciless course of history. Their whole existence is, quote, nothing more than a protest against a great historical revolution, end quote. Engels. The brutal manner in which Engels concluded his diatribe against Bakunin may explain the uncompromising attitude Engels later took towards Alexander Herzen's socialist, quote, pan-Slavism. Quote, in answer to the sentimental phrases of brotherhood offered here in Bakunin's book or pamphlet, Appeal to the Slavs, in the name of the most counter-revolutionary European nations, we reply that Russophobia was and still is the primary revolutionary passion. The primary revolutionary passion of the Germans. That since the revolution, hatred of the Czechs and Croats has been added, and that we, together with the Poles and the Magyars, can guarantee the revolution only by carrying out the most decisive terrorism against these Slavic peoples. Battle, quote, an unrelenting battle to the death, end quote. Bracket, Engels here quotes Bakunin, who used this phrase to express his support for a great and free Slavdom. End bracket. Against the Slavs, the betrayers of the revolution, a war of extermination and ruthless terrorism, not in the interest of Germany, but in the interest of the revolution. End quote. Engels. Recognizable in these lines is the more or less conscious refusal of the, quote, Marx Party to join in the debate over Russia and Europe that was stirred up among the philosophers of history in Western Europe during the late 1840s and early 1850s. To Marx and Engels, matters like the anticipated revolution in France and the crisis provoked by Russia in the Orient must have seemed much too important to allow them to concern themselves seriously with Alexander Herzen's anti-Occidental campaign, for example, with its plea for Russia's, quote, primitive socialism, end quote. Footnote. An opposing view is presented in the exchange between Moses Hess and Herzen. In the book Vom anderen Ufer, a book published anonymously in Hamburg in 1850, Herzen prophesied that the Slavic family of peoples would be heir to the senile European. Hess replied, quote, I admit that the Slavs are a modern Byzantium, an Occidental China, but I don't think that they can make of our Europe a social democratic republic if Europe cannot liberate itself, end quote. Moses Hess. End footnote. Even after Herzen's emigration to London in 1852, Marx and Engels were hardly willing to take note of a Russian writer who, in their estimation, deserved at most a place in the chronique scandaleuse of the party-colored political emigration. Engels was chiefly preoccupied with the conditions and prospects of a war led by the Holy Alliance against revolutionary France, a war in which the, quote, half-barbarian Russian troops would form by sheer weight of numbers, quote, the core and mainstay, the pivot, end quote, of the coalition army. Footnote. According to the manuscript published in the Marx Engels work, concerning the Russian army, see, this is a page citation of Engels' work, Marx Engels' works. Quote, General Engels apparently had no scruples about commanding the proletarian revolution to use the means and methods of modern warfare discovered by the bourgeoisie. End footnote. It was only in this connection that Engels had occasion to mention Herzen, whose book, Du Développement des idées révolutionnaires in Russie, he had received through Marx. Assuming a conflict between Europe and Tsarist absolutism to be imminent, Engels was interested in, quote, what would be required of a revolutionary army in case of the welcome offensive against Russia, end quote. Engels. And that's from a letter to Joseph Weidemeyer, April 12, 1853, excuse me. Apart from the strategic side of this problem, Engels estimated the possibility of internal turmoil within Russia. He stressed that, quote, among the possible prospects, end quote, would be, quote, an aristocratic bourgeois revolution in Petersburg with subsequent civil war in the interior, end quote. Referring to Herzen's work, he wrote, quote, Herr Herzen has simplified that for himself by inventing, in Hegelian fashion, a democratic social communist Proudhonian Republic of Russia under the triumvirate of Bakunin, Herzen, Golovin, or Golovin, Golovin, so that absolutely nothing is lacking, end quote. Engels. When the pan-Slavic influence began to be noticeable in the Anglo-American press, Marx lost his temper with the, quote, miserable Russians, unquote, for harping on the theme that, quote, the Russian people are thoroughly democratic, and that Russia, parenthesis, the emperor and the bureaucracy, in parenthesis, as well as aristocracy, is German, end quote. Marx to Engels. September 7, 1853. Marx urged Engels to attack the, quote, idiotic idea, end quote, that Germany was to be fought in Russia and not Russia in Germany. Recalling the, quote, Teutonic asses, end quote, who, quote, blamed the German despotism of Friedrich II, etc., on the French, as if backward slaves did not always need civilized slaves to keep them in line, end quote. Marx to Engels, September 7, 1853. Marx presumably noted as well that not only the Russian Herzen, but also German authors were debating the question of Russia's world historical role, because the ranks of the latter included his former fellow student and combatant Bruno Bauer. Bauer had been the target of caustic polemics in the book The German Ideology, where Marx and Engels attacked him as a, quote, critical critic, end quote, and as a young Hegelian who despised the masses. Like Herzen before him, Bauer's image of Russia was fashioned in the early 1850s with the help of the Westphalian Baron August von Haxthausen Studien concerning Russia's internal conditions and rural structure, published in 1847 and 1852. To Bauer, Russian absolutism represented the rebirth of Roman statesmanship, a religiously conditioned life principle appropriate for the masses, which he contrasted with the democratic liberalism of the decaying Western bourgeoisie. He consoled a divided, quote, Teutonism, I guess that's Germanism, with the rich prospect of sharing its anticipated security as a nation with a people, quote, which since Peter the Great has deduced from his unity of purpose a scorn for all half measures, end quote. A people, quote, destined by its gigantic talent to upset the axioms and dogmas of the West, end quote. Bruno Bauer. Even before Marx learned of Bruno Bauer's other pamphlets, which were written in the same reactionary spirit, he urged Engels to speak out against the growing Russomania that made a mockery of their own theory of history and civilization. Engels earnestly set about accomplishing this task. His unfinished, unpublished writing on Germanen und Slaventum consisted primarily of a sharp criticism of Alexander Herzen's messianic belief in Russia's socialist calling, a belief that resembled that of Bauer in its denunciation of the bourgeois democratic and proletarian revolutionary West. Footnote. For details on Engels' unfinished pamphlet, Germanen und das Slaventum, see Gustav Meyer's Friedrich Engels biography, Volume 2. The manuscript was originally in the literary archives of Marx and Engels, now maintained by the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. Helmut Krause conjectures that it was, quote, taken along back to Moscow by Ryazanov, end quote. End footnote. Engels treated Herzen as one of those pan-Slavists who longed for Slavic conquest of Europe and who dreamed of the 1,000-year Reich of the Russian village Commune. Engels accused Herzen of plagiarizing Haxthausen and ridiculed the boastful dilettantism of the Russian intelligentsia, quote, as the individual, so the nation, just impress Europe. Behind that, the bad conscience of inner barbarism, end quote. Engels had developed together with Marx a, quote, theory of Asiatic despotism that held the absence of private property to be the key to the political and religious history of the entire Orient. Quote, Engels took up this line of thought in his pamphlet Germanen und Slaventum, in which he stressed, while conceding to Haxthausen that Tsarism supplemented communal democracy, that the entire Orient lacked private property. The link between the community and the state Engels had developed, together with Marx, a quote, theory of Asiatic despotism that held the absence of private property to be the key to the political and religious history of the entire Orient. Quote, Engels took up this line of thought in his pamphlet Germanenum und Slaventum, in which he stressed, while conceding to Haxthausen that Tsarism supplemented communal democracy, that the entire Orient lacked private property, the link between the community and the state, and that, by contrast, the Teutonic Gauss system of government signified an organic advance. End quote. Gustav Meyer. The difficulties that Marx and Engels encountered in conducting a journalistic campaign against Herzen and Bauer now presumably prompted Marx to publish a writing of his own designed, in a certain sense, to demonstrate both that the development of Russian autocracy corresponded to a natural law, and that Herzen's and Bauer's messianic Russophile pronouncements were utterly unfounded. Footnote. Ryazanov remarks on Marx and Engels' anti-pan-Slavic articles, which were not printed by the New York Daily Tribune because of, quote, Russophilia, in his introduction to Gesammelte Schriften, Volume 1, and footnote. Marx apparently took this project seriously, for among other things, Marx refused to participate in an international meeting called by his Chartist friends and declared that, quote, nowhere and never, end quote, did he want to, quote, figure together, end quote, with Herzen, and was not of a mind, quote, to see old Europe renewed by Russian blood, end quote. Marx to Engels, February 13th, 1855. With regard to Bruno Bauer, Marx had every reason to refute the, quote, pedantic old professors, end quote, metaphysical speculations on history with a myth-free interpretation of history based on rigorously empirical investigation. During one of his London visits, Bauer explained to Marx's standpoint on Russia as follows, quote, the old state of affairs in the West must be overturned. This can only come from the Orient, since the Oriental alone has real hate, namely, hate for the Occidental. And Russia, besides being the only European country where there is still cohesion, is the sole compact power of the Orient, end quote. Marx to Engels, January 18th, 1856. As with many other of his important literary and scientific plans, Marx was only able to accomplish part of this project. 13 articles that he published in David Urquhart's London Free Press from August 16th to 1856 to April 1st, 1857, were conceived of as an introduction to a larger work whose aim was accurately described by David Ryazanov. Quote, Marx seeks in the distant past the solution of the riddle of Russia's colossal power and of the old Anglo-Russian slavery under whose yoke the whole of Europe groaned, end quote. Ryazanov. In his Revelations on the diplomatic history of the 18th century, Marx used his materialistic method as a means of critically understanding history, far exceeding both the monumental and the antiquarian approaches to history. To use Nietzsche's distinction, he possessed that power of subjectivity needed to, quote, shatter and dissolve a past, unquote, which Nietzsche required of the historian who serves life. That is, defend certain values of life by pronouncing a judgment on the past, carefully investigating, and finally condemning it. When he received Bruno Bauer's pamphlets on Russia, Marx was again motivated to take up the Russian problem. Just as he had attacked the quote, critical critic's thoughts on philosophy, a history more than 12 years earlier, in the book The Holy Family, he began now to examine closely the world political opinions advanced by the apologists of the Russian dictatorship. But his interest in Bauer's Russo-maniac eschatology did not last. He and Engels would soon perceive that Russian society, ostensibly condemned to inertia, was exposed to internal tensions, and that it was therefore possible to treat the relations between the Russian state and Russian society in terms of the materialist conception of history. Footnote. In late 1855, Bruno Bauer turned up at Marx's home in London and subsequently paid him numerous visits. A year later, Bauer sent Marx's pamphlets on Russia. Quote, weak and pretentious, end quote, was Marx's judgment, letter to Engels, January 10, 1857. Marx had seriously considered publishing an attack on Bauer, as is confirmed by a fragmentary writing found among his posthumous papers. And footnote. To my knowledge, the original German version of Marx's manuscript has never been published. At any rate, it, as well as Engels' Deutschland und das Slaventum, has not been included in the volumes of the Marx-Engels work. End footnote. New section. The Founder's Bequest to Russia. The Russian Revolution of 1917 is a unique example of an event of immense historical importance that is held to conform to a scientific theory or formula. This claim is strengthened in that the, quote, Russian October has come to signify the beginning of the era of consciously, quote, made revolutions, and therefore of that his social form that, according to Karl Marx, concludes, quote, the prehistory of human society, end quote. The myth of the Russian Commune is due chiefly to a twofold merit of, quote, scientific socialism, its universal validity both as an analytic theory of the, quote, natural processes of history, end quote. Capital Volume 1. As Marx would have us understand the development of economic social structures, and as a, quote, guide to action, end quote, as Engels stressed. Footnote. See the letter of Engels to F.A. Zorga, November 29th, 1886, quote, even the Germans, do not understand the theory for the most part and treat it doctrinally and dogmatically as if it were something to be learned by heart, It is for them a credo, not a guide to action, end quote. Engels. Letter to F.A. Zorga. Yet precisely with respect to Russia, Marx and Engels formulated their theoretical legacy with such clarity that it became a veritable warning to their Russian followers. Social disturbances in Tsarist Russia, constantly more numerous and more severe, ultimately signaled the presence there of active revolutionary forces that inaugurated the spontaneous historical activity of the Russian masses. These forces rendered superfluous the use of any doctrinaire recipe derived from the experiences of the Western labor movement to attain their goal, the overthrow of Tsarist absolutism. The, quote, founders may well have had doubts about the populist religious faith in the peasant communities, yet they were much closer to the revolutionary praxis of the populace, including their terrorism, than to the sectarian discords generated by the rival groups of Russian emigres. A spokesman for the Geneva-based Russian section of the International Working Men's Association. Marx expected not a revolutionary or, quote, Marxist party platform, but cooperation in liberating Poland through elimination of Russian militarism. Quote, as the precondition for the universal liberation of the European proletariat. Footnote: the General Council of the International Working Men's Association to the members of the Committee section in Geneva. Marx's activity in the General Council of the International, together with the publication of Marx's Capital, created even in Russian political and intellectual circles, an attentive public whose efforts for reform he now had to take into account. When he recognized that even Tsarist Russia was a class society entangled in antagonistic interests, he began studying Russian in order to examine the source material concerning its economic and social situation. More than a decade of research, which, as Engels irritably realized, prevented Marx from finishing Capital, led Marx to discover that the Russian peasantry was a potentially revolutionary element. The hope that communism would shape Russia's social future depended upon the preservation of the old village community, an arrangement widespread among the Slavic peoples, and one that displayed their historical gift for comradely self-administration. This unexpected viewpoint, which Engels eventually came to share during Marx's lifetime, meant a reconciliation with Herzen and Bakunin, both of whom had died, inasmuch as Marx and Engels' Russophobia now gave way to a positive, albeit qualified, valuation of the social tendencies of the Russian people. Either Russian society would be regenerated through the resistance of the rural communities to the disintegrating impact of capitalism, or it would adapt more or less rapidly in its economic and social facets to the capitalist modes of production already strongly rooted in the West. These were the rigorously pondered alternatives that Marx recommended to his Russian followers as a kind of theoretical guide for their political action. Engels abandoned his friend's Russian legacy when he realized that the Obschina was condemned to extinction. He believed himself authorized to console Russian socialists with the one remaining prospect, that the blessings of capitalism outweighed by far the advantages of the peasant community. Engels challenged the Narodniki to give up their belief in any special, quote, spontaneously communist, end quote, mission of Russia, and at every opportunity, Engels condemned the doctrinaire and sectarian attitude of the first Russian Marxists. He warned them that not only would, quote, profane Russia have to assume the difficult process of transforming its economy, but would also have to be prepared for a long bourgeois liberal period of political and cultural re-education. The dissensions among those Russian followers in emigration especially exasperated Engels because of their mania for ascribing greater importance to scholarly interpretations of the Marxian writings, quote, as if they were texts taken from the classics or from the New Testament, end quote, than to the events occurring at all levels of Russian society itself, events that he, Engels, valued as signs of the inevitable bourgeois revolution in Russia, patterned after the Russian Revolution of 1789. Footnote. See Engels to Danielson, October 17th, 1893. Apparently, it was from a reading, perhaps only superficial, of Plekhanov's book, Our Differences of Opinion, that Engels derived his understanding of the Russian Marxists. While recognizing the importance of capitalism as a school for the predominantly peasant population, they nevertheless underestimated the educative function of liberalism. The high esteem in which he and Marx held the revolutionary party of the, quote, people's will is not unrelated to the fact that the manifesto published by the executive committee of the Narodnaya Volya after Alexander II's assassination was inspired by a, quote, statesmanlike, end quote, spirit completely alien to the Russian Marxists, who persisted in anti-Narodniki sectarianism. Let me repeat that sentence. I feel like I missed something. The high esteem in which he and Marx held the revolutionary party of the, quote, people's will is not unrelated to the fact that the manifesto published by the Executive Committee of the Narodnaya Volya after Alexander II's assassination was inspired by a, quote, statesman-like spirit completely alien to the Russian Marxists who persisted in anti-Narodniki sectarianism. Certainly, the people who risked their lives planning and executing terrorist attacks knew much less of the book The German Ideology and Capital than did Plekhanov, but they were less estranged from the wishes and needs of the Russian masses than were the self-styled disciples of Marx, who were wrangling about, quote, organizational questions, unquote, and wanted to direct the Russian revolutionary movement from their Swiss exile. In their letter to Alexander III, the Narodovoltsy authors enumerated the conditions to be met before their revolutionary movement could be succeeded by peaceful action, and stressed that these were not demands, but necessary consequences of the events themselves that the Executive Committee was merely putting into writing. Quote, first, general amnesty for all political offenders for having committed no crime, but having simply fulfilled their duty as citizens. Second, convocation of representatives of the entire people in order to deliberate on and reform social and political life according to the people's wishes and needs. We feel it necessary to point out, however, that power can be validated by representatives of the people only if the elections are completely free. Therefore, these elections must be held under the following conditions. 1. The deputies should be nominated from all classes without discrimination and in proportion to the population. 2. No restrictions of any kind would be set either on the electors or on the elected. 3. The electoral campaign and the elections themselves must be completely free. The government must therefore allow provisionally until a decision is taken by popular assembly: A. Unrestricted freedom of the press. B. Unrestricted freedom of speech. C. Unrestricted freedom of assembly. D. Unrestricted freedom of electoral platforms. And quote. Footnote. Quote, a struggle for a moderately liberal constitution. That was the objective meaning of the Narodnaya Volya's legendary revolutionary work, quote, according to Theodore Dan. See the book The Origins of Bolshevism, edited by Joel Carmichael, 1964. And footnote. This program, drawn up by the Narodnaya Volya, evidently inspired Engels' radical criticism of Plekhanov, who had attacked the terrorists from a doctrinaire Marxist standpoint. An examination of Engels' writings and correspondence in 1883 concerning the problems of the Russian revolutionary movement inspires this assumption. Expressing his outrage over Plekhanov's attack in the presence of a visitor, Alexander Vodin, he also appeared to be astonished at Plekhanov's conception of the proletarian dictatorship. And that's a very important question because, to my understanding, that's the Leninist genesis of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the genesis of the Leninist conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, seems to have, or is said to have had its roots in Plekhanov, and I'm not exactly sure in what way. There's an article somewhere that's like the dictatorship of the proletariat from Plekhanov to Lenin. But that's an interesting statement. Even if we question the credibility of Vodin's report, it's hard to doubt Engels' ironic rejection of the notion that the proletarian dictatorship may be realized by the dictatorship of a Marxist intelligentsia. Thus, it is no exaggeration to say that essentially the legacy bequeathed by Marx and Engels to their Russian followers has proven to be prophetic indeed. In defending the independently creative initiative of all social levels oppressed by Tsarist absolutism, it implicitly condemns that party fetishism that was cultivated by all factions of Russian social democracy and has colored the history of the Soviet Union ever since the, quote, Great October. Okay, this seems to me like a good spot to cut this video in half since it's so long. So yeah, that's the end of this. The first section of the next video is titled Charisma and Political Leadership. Thanks for listening.